Hello everyone, I wanted to break down shoulder mechanics for you in a way that helped me totally revolutionize the way that I understood and worked with the shoulder. Understanding the concepts I'm about to show you in this video were just so important for me. Understanding the concepts I'm about to show you in this video were the keys for me to better understand what limitations I was specifically looking at the shoulder, why people would get locked up in certain ranges of motion, and what I could do to best pick certain positions of the shoulder to restore range of motion and also get pain-free function of it. This is also best taught with some slides. So I took a snippet from my biomechanics course, which by the way has a massive, really great flash sale going on, which expires this Thursday. So if you want to get in on that, I'll link that down below in the description. Okay, now we're going to get into what happens when we move into the equivalent of the hip flexion arc for the upper body. You guys remember that? 0 to 60, 60 to 100, and then over 100. Very similar thing applies here. When we move into humeral flexion, initially, we have that 0 to 60 range, just like the pelvis. There's not a whole lot of scapular movement happening here. So imagine your hands down by your side. You can just feel this out literally for yourself. Just lift your arm to 60 degrees of shoulder flexion. Not much happened there, right? You didn't feel a lot of stuff on the backside of your rib cage turn on. You didn't feel a lot of scapular movement because there's not a lot. Once we move past 60 degrees, things ramp up a little bit. But what we call this is humeral external rotation and relative scapular internal rotation because there's not a lot of scapular movement. So relative to what the humerus is doing, yeah, that's an internally rotated position of your scapula. So really, it's just that. You're not seeing a lot of movement. I have a bunch of different angles for this, so that way you guys can visualize this. You can see the humerus sliding back into ER. You can see that you're going to get just the smallest bit of relative scapular internal rotation, but really it's just a movement of the humerus for the most part in that range. Therefore, if I were to be in a, let's say, 45-degree reach or 45-degree position of my humerus relative to my trunk, the angle is always relative to the position of your trunk. It's not the floor or anything else. It's here. We're not going to have a lot of concentric muscular activity below 60 degrees. So if I'm in 45 degrees, I'm going to get a lot of expansion below the level of my scapula. Really, you're going to get a lot of expansion in your whole posterior rib cage, but you're really going to maximize the opportunity for you to get expansion at that lower below T8 region. This is ideal for beginners. This is ideal to reach in a low position for people that have a lot of issues. It's generally helpful to start at the lowest level of the rib cage anyway and work your way up from there. Generally, where is the concentric muscle activity is the question to ask. If stuff is concentric and tight, you're probably not going to get a lot of expansion there relative to areas that are more eccentric. From 60 to 120 degrees, we're starting to now get some serious upward rotation and scapular external rotation. The humerus is going to move into relative internal rotation because the scapula is really externally rotating and upwardly rotating so much. So after we clear 60 degrees, we really start to get that happening. So the humerus is going to be internally rotating relative to the scapula, which needs to stay on the rib cage. The scapula is going up. It doesn't also want to fall off. So it has to externally rotate. And remember, external rotation is the medial border going in. So we're getting that help from those scapular external rotators, like I mentioned, way back. These muscles are assisting the scapula staying on the rib cage, so that way it doesn't fall off. So at this point, we're throwing in another arrow. You can see that the red is the humeral internal rotation. The yellow is the scapular external rotation. Orange is the upward rotation. So this is where your serratus is working. This is where some of your rhomboids are working to control that external rotation. Therefore, because you have more concentric orientation of those scapular external rotation muscles primarily, you will not be getting a lot of expansion on your posterior rib cage because stuff is working. But you will be getting some expansion on your anterior rib cage because that's the area where you won't be getting a lot of concentric muscle activity. So if I were to reach straight ahead of me, that would actually give me more pump handle expansion than back posterior expansion. Reason being the serratus and those scapular ER muscles are tighter. Now, you may breathe in that position and feel some expansion happening back there. You are always getting everything, but it's just that you're biasing certain areas more than others. Does that make sense? So if I wanted to drive air into the front side of my rib cage, one way I could do that is with a 90-degree reach. A 90-degree hip flexion position is also a position of internal rotation. You can think of it the same way as the humerus here. From 120 to 180, we're going to be getting humeral external rotation relative to scapular internal rotation because our scapula is already pretty externally rotated. We don't have much more room for the scapula to move up on the rib cage. So we have to do something else in order to get the arm overhead. That is going to be posterior tipping of the scapula. We're going to be getting upward rotation of the scap, but posterior tipping, meaning that we're going to have the entire scap move down and out of the way. Let me demonstrate for you what this means after you kind of look at this image a little bit. So there's now 4 things going on here, which makes it a little bit more complicated. But all you really got to know is that the humerus is going to be moving more than the scapula in terms of its rotation. So we get more humeral external rotation. Relative to that, the scap is IR'd. But if you're already up here and you can't really get much more upward rotation, one strategy you can use as the humerus continues to externally rotate is you can just tip the scap back. Do you see that? That posterior tipping will allow you to get more flexion of the humerus. All right, let's go through all of that so that way you can see it. From 0 to 60, we're going to have the humerus move into external rotation, and you're not going to get a lot of scapular movement. From 60 to 120, as you go up, the humerus is going to relatively internally rotate while the scap moves into external rotation. So the scap has to begin to stay on the rib cage. So as it upwardly rotates, it's going to externally rotate like that. Once you get to 120 degrees, you're going to start to see more external rotation of the humerus. So it's going to slide out like that. You can see how that natural external rotation allows for more flexion. And at the most upper ranges of that, you're going to see the scapula tip back. That's it in a nutshell. Because we have a lot of concentric muscle activity, there's certain areas where you're not really going to get much expansion, but you will be driving air into the lower part of the anterior rib cage because things are so lifted up down there. So this is going to help me elevate down here a lot more. And you're going to be getting some upper pump handle expansion too. You're just opening up a lot of space for the anterior rib cage to expand, particularly down here. So if I want to get below the ISA expansion, an upper reach would be great. You will also be getting some most upper posterior expansion because stuff here has to be able to yield to some extent to allow for that posterior tipping. But ultimately, I would use an upper reach to get anterior expansion. Your pecs and lats will have to become more eccentrically oriented to allow your arm to go overhead. Those are 2 big muscle groups that can really limit how much expansion you get if they're tight. So the idea is ER to IR to ER of the humerus. So this slide can do a really good job of summarizing that for you. The arrows can help show what's going on. But really, what this is trying to show us is how this is similar to the hip flexion arc, but also it has its own nuance in its own way, obviously. It's not the same joint. If I wanted to get certain areas of expansion, this is a cheat sheet for you to kind of see where you would go with that. So if I wanted to get posterior lower expansion, I'd probably do a low reach. If I wanted to get anterior upper expansion, I might do a 60 to 120 degree reach. If I wanted to get anterior lower expansion, I might do an upper reach. And remember, it's a gradient. So it's not like you're shutting off everything and only getting expansion in one area. You're getting it everywhere. That's why simply just teaching someone how to breathe better can improve their assessments systemically.